Hello and welcome to the Liberate Yourself podcast. I'm Trista Dedman, and this is a platform for benevolent souls to discuss their beautiful ideas around cultivating personal sovereignty in these changing times. My guest today is perfectly positioned to talk about this topic. Bill Kirst is a change management consultant who builds bridges between the practical working world and spiritual discovery. He is an informative and delightful guest, and I know you're going to find many valuable elements in our conversation. So let's get to it. Thank you so much for being here with me.
You're very welcome.
Well, I wanted to have you on because, for one, we met and hit it off on many different topics very easily. You're a fascinating, expansive, chatty person, and you have lots of information to share. But also, I find it really fascinating that you deal with change in many different ways. In your career, which we'll talk about, and also you have a podcast that talks about change in this ever-changing world, a lot like this one.
Sure.
So I'm really interested to get your perspective from, I'm interested in getting another perspective on this, especially coming from, the corporate world and a pragmatic application of what change means. And we'll also get into a little bit more of like your spiritual journey and how that weaves into your daily life. So, but if you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about where you are now in terms of your life and your work, and how you bring change to your life and to others' lives.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess in life, I'm a 40-year-old male, so I think it's kind of a fascinating time to be to be alive, but also to be turning 40. And I think we chatted a little bit before around this whole concept of the midlife crisis, and I've chatted with a number of people, including on my podcast, where a new term came to me as one of my guests talked about a quarter life crisis. I think that guest was about 25. And initially I kind of thought, is that such a thing? And the more I've actually done quite a bit of research on even things like astrology, right? I realized that there is a lot of truth to something that is a quarter life crisis, a midlife crisis, as we call it, and even beyond. But what's interesting for me is I actually feel probably for the first time in my life that I'm not anywhere near crisis. I actually feel more connected and more in tune than I ever have. And so when I turned 40 this year, it was really interesting because I had a desire to actually turn 40 in a relatively quiet way, relatively solitudinal. And initially people kind of thought, it's your 40th, over the hill. What do you want to do? And I had some, some interesting conversations with friends saying, I actually want to go be on a beach, kind of by myself. And they thought, oh no, that sounds kind of sad. And I said, no, actually it sounds kind of wonderful. And so I think I had a very different approach to turning 40 because for the first time, I think probably I am more than I'm listening to my mind. And that's been a really interesting shift for me as someone who has always strived to learn and achieve academically and in a career fashion and play multiple roles.
And you're very mental. Like one of your strengths is mental acuity, I would say.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of very exact in my desire to learn and shape things. And so that part for me personally has been really rewarding, and the giving myself permission to kind of listen to my body and not always let the mind take over and sort of take the reins has actually generated some really positive outcomes personally and professionally. So on the career side, it's been pretty fascinating because, as you mentioned, I get the opportunity and kind of the honor of getting to help people work through change in their daily lives. And so, my title is organizational change management consultant, and that's kind of a lot of words for those that aren't as familiar with that space. You're a little bit of a coach. You're a little bit of a therapist. You're where you are and how you're helping people navigate that change. And so I've been really enjoying it. I do it really well, and I'm finally starting to realize why I do it as well as I do is because I'm a highly sensitive person, and I'm empathic, and one of my number one skills is empathy. And as I navigated life and career and many roles, I think I always knew that deep down inside, but I didn't let my mind go there because terms like sensitive and empathic are not necessarily attributed to strong males.
I was gonna say, yeah, especially for men.
Yeah, and
As a
so
power,
as
especially.
absolutely, and I think these past several years I've actually started to realize and embrace it. It feels like a superpower,
hmm
honestly, Trista. It feels like this is the opposite of weakness. It is
hmm
strength, and it is the ability to impact and change people's lives for the better by having these abilities or these capabilities. And so that's kind of where I'm at personally and professionally. Is I'm finally listening to my body, and it's generating some amazing reflection and some incredible results for other people through a career lens on a day-to-day basis.
When you say your body, can you clarify a bit what you mean? Like, do you mean you're getting more into your heart, using your body as an instrument of like attunement to feel things out? Can you talk about what that,
Sure.
looks like and feels like?
Yeah, so I think when I say that, I think it is definitely kind of more heart center. I've been on probably a multi-year cultivation, if you will, through meditation and mindfulness, and I think that's been going on for about 3 or 4 years. And why I say cultivating is because you have to kind of dig through the soil of all the things that you carry to allow yourself to open up. And so for me to move from kind of out of the head and the mind into the heart has been a lot of work, and that's what I mean when I say I feel it in the body. I feel it a little more in the I've been learning these past couple of years about chakras and the importance of being grounded and kind of grounding in your chakras before you can kind of move up. And like the solar plexus is such an interesting place because in sort of a masculine way, I think a lot of men are sort of brought up to kind of project through the solar plexus,
hmm
and oftentimes we don't make it past that. And
Yeah.
so I think for me, I've been able to do this meditative and mindfulness work, do some centering of the chakras, understand the importance of grounding and being present in my body, and it's actually opened me up even more into what would be the heart chakra, or dare I say the throat chakra, which is all about finding your voice and using
hmm
that voice for good.
hmm And so how do you what would your daily responsibilities in your career look like as far as so kind of explain what change management is and how your empathic abilities, come into play.
Sure. I would say there's no typical day when it comes to change, and I think
Sure.
that's just because there's a tremendous amount of change coming at people in every direction these days. My 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 common kind of day would involve usually about 2 to 3 clients over the course of the day, and those clients or customers or partners could be struggling or navigating any sort of change. Let's say, for example, that they had a new CEO come in, or they bought another company and they were trying to merge those companies together, or something as simple as, "Hey, we're switching out your laptop," right? Like we think it's pretty simple when somebody says, "Hey, you're getting a new piece of technology," but one of the things I've learned is that, you know, pieces of technology that we've started to rely on as devices and things like email and the way we communicate are actually very intimate experiences.
Yes, I can like personally attest to this. I just got a new laptop
Right.
and I name them like
Yes.
the one I had before is Proletariat and he was the workhorse. And now I
Right.
have Sophia and she's like going to be the divine, messenger of knowledge and wisdom. And but yeah, the transition is a very emotional one because you're kind of
Yes.
like saying goodbye and it needs to be a transition. It's not like you're just getting rid of the old, like there's memories there. I mean, that goes into a whole huge conversation that could be had about our relationship with technology. But yeah,
Right.
I
Yeah. So
just wanted to interject that.
yeah, it's perfect timing. Yeah, you're going through it yourself, and so it's really no different than what you're explaining, the experience you're going through. And and one of the things I've done over the past probably 5 to 10 years, I've been reading a lot about the way the brain works and neuroscience. And one of the things I've discovered is that there are these mirror receptors or mirroring neurons that you have in the brain, that people who are highly sensitive or empathic actually have mirror neurons that are more attuned or highly attuned. And what that means on a day-to-day basis is if I'm working with someone who's going through some sort of change, um, I actually feel their emotions as if they are my own.
Hmm.
Additionally, when people go through, what's interesting is when change happens, the same receptors in the body fire as if pain were happening.
Really?
Yeah.
That's why
Initially,
change is so hard
right,
sometimes.
right.
Yeah.
The body doesn't really understand is this a tiger coming after you, or is this just somebody coming to switch your laptop? Now
Wow.
the
And the adrenaline and everything
yeah,
goes off as well.
yeah.
Wow. I didn't know that.
So the same pain receptors fire, and then what usually happens is our brain then goes in and says, "Okay, look around. Let me see, is this a tiger or is this just a laptop switch?" And then we start to sort of dial it back down. But the challenge, Trista, is this: those receptors have already fired, and it's
Hmm.
already triggered some of the adrenaline, and it's triggered the adrenal glands. And so that's why we then have to listen to our body and say, okay, hold on a second. Do I really need to go into fight or flight mode? How
Hmm.
significant of a change is this? But all that happens in milliseconds.
Right.
And to me, is the work I get to do with people, because when I'm with them and I see the change happening, I am experiencing it alongside them, which means I can say to them, "You're not alone."
Yep.
And to me, the work I do day in and day out, why it's so rewarding, why I love doing it, is I get to create a sense of belonging and connection and community in a pretty scattered world.
Yes.
And just being able to do that, sit with someone and say to them and emulate to them that you're not alone, is kind of the best part about it. So
Hmm.
on a day-to-day basis, it can be one-on-one, but I can also be doing it in front of, a room of 100 people standing on a stage talking about change and what's coming.
Mm.
And that can be a little bit more challenging as an empath, because
Hmm.
imagine being in a room, you walk into that room, there's hundreds of people there, and it's not like I don't hear the things that they're necessarily feeling or saying in their minds, but I definitely sense it. And I have to perform in a way where, what I say and what comes across is, I feel you
Hmm.
and I'm here for you, and we're going to get through this together. But in rooms of 100 people or more, it can be pretty trying and a little bit debilitating.
I can imagine. And I mean, I feel like what kind of came to me too is that, especially where we are in Seattle, which is like, huge tech boom city,
Mhm.
especially right now and continues to grow. I feel like you're bringing this element of connection in that may otherwise be looked over. I don't know. I'm not, part of the tech corporate world, but I can feel that a lot of times when I'm moving through the city. It feels like people are really hungry for that kind of connection and to be seen. Would you agree with that? And does that
Yeah,
happen in your work?
it absolutely does. I would agree with the observation. As you mentioned, we live in Seattle. I live on Capitol Hill, but I also get to travel quite a bit in this
Hmm.
job, which is great. So moving, moving between spaces and moving to different places is a really eye-opening experience, because when you go to a place like New York and then you come back to a place like Seattle, or you go to a place like Texas and you come back to a place like Seattle, um, you do notice these small differences. And one of the things I have felt here in Seattle over the past, I'd say 4 years or so, um, it's a city that's changed quite a bit. There's a lot of people moving here because it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a great lifestyle.
Hmm.
It's very good work-life balance, and there's tremendous opportunity. It's a booming city. As a result, you have kind of this cacophony of different cultures happening.
Yes.
And while people came here for pursuit of a job or a new beginning, I think they didn't stop and give themselves time to understand what a sense of belonging felt like, and where do
Yeah.
you find connection. And I will fault technology a little bit. I mean, it can also put up barriers and walls and make people feel as if they're connected for that sort of instant dopamine hit, but then can promulgate a pretty lonely experience. So I do see it a lot in a tech space. I imagine it's probably even more challenging in places like Silicon Valley, or even places like Austin, where that's starting to emerge.
Hmm.
In cities like New York and Washington D.C., they're similar but a little bit different, because I feel like they've been around longer.
Yeah.
And I think there's communities within communities within communities. So
Yes.
even if you have that go between, you can step back into a sense of belonging in a borough, or
Hmm.
in a neighborhood. And Seattle has that too. I just think the time we're experiencing right now, with the growth and the opportunity, there's a bit of people being lost in the in between. And
Hmm.
like you said, to be seen, to be heard, to have a sense of belonging, there's nothing better. There's nothing more powerful.
Hmm. I know that is really powerful. So, how has, let's switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
And if you want to talk about your spiritual journey
Yeah.
and like kind of when that began and some elements of that, what it feels like for you, and then eventually like how you weave that into the work that you do
Yeah.
in the day to day, you know?
Yeah. I love the word spiritual. It keeps coming up quite a bit in places that I don't necessarily expect. And the reason I like it is because I actually was born and raised and grew up an Irish Roman Catholic. And I think it's important to say the Irish Roman Catholic, and
Yes.
hopefully people who will be listening and that may resonate, they'll understand what I mean by that. But what I mean by that is it comes with tradition, and it comes with a sense of tribe and family, um, and sort of the power of belonging, right? And so I was raised in that way and in that fashion, and I think there were a lot of spiritual elements around the traditions and the religious ceremonies, but I always felt like I was lacking a little bit of um, that true light within some of that. Um, as I've grown up, and as I mentioned, I'm now 40, and I've navigated the different challenges of growing up Irish Roman Catholic, but also growing up and navigating coming out as a gay man, and all of the challenges that came with that, serving in the military for 12 years and all the challenges that came with that. I think it's shaped me to understand that spirituality is something that you cannot put inside four walls
Hmm.
of a cathedral, of a temple. You know,
It's a
it's
very
some
personal experience.
Yeah, and it's something that honestly, it's so enormous and so powerful, yet it can exist on a single grain of sand. And to me, that's where I find it in different places and different spaces. You and I talked about the power of place for me. So when I go to places like Ireland and I land on that soil, to me, a tremendous amount of spirituality comes through. I think that's because it's ancestral. There's a connection there, but I also have a similar type of spirituality that comes when I'm in places like Rome, Italy, and it's not necessarily because of the Vatican. It's probably more to do with the Roman history and ancient Rome, and so I find myself called to places that sort of release the sense of spirituality to me, and I'm now finding it a little bit more in things like astrology and astronomy, and you and I talked about astrocartography, and so to me it leaves me more and more hungry to learn, and that's an aspect of life that excites me. Is spirituality doesn't have keeps going, and it's about discovery, it's about reflection, and it's about learning. And to me, I feel like this whole journey is just beginning, even though I'm 40 years into this life, and I've got a lot of tradition and sort of rigor behind me. I feel like I'm just tapping into it now. And then I think the second part of your question, how does that work into my day to day and my work? I think it allows me to come with a little more grace in everything I do. I seek to see the spiritual potential in everything I do and every person I work with. And again, that doesn't mean they have to be religious. It doesn't mean they have to have any sort of way in which they, put things into a box or a dogma at all. It's just helping find the light in someone that they may not necessarily know they have. And that's why I do this work, and that's why I'm continuing to do this work, because, we all kind of have this, what's my purpose? Why am I here? And the closest I've been able to put words to that for me is my purpose is to help others find their true potential. Whether they knew it or not, it's there, that light is there. And so I think spirituality, in many ways I'm learning, are just increasing the number of, gates to that destination.
What are some modalities that you've come across? One thing I wanted to back up and just mention, it is interesting when you start on the spiritual path, because I think that it's sort of the antithesis to what we have been told in a very like linear leaning society, because you realize, well, from my experience anyway, I think when you follow certain traditions, you pick up on the fact that everything is cycles.
Yes.
And so there isn't a beginning and an end. There is no end point to get to that you're working towards. Like you said, like, you were really rigorous academically and learning. And I think a lot of times we're taught that learning is to get, the carrot at the end of the stick or whatever.
Yeah.
There's going to be something light at the end of the tunnel, but spiritual learning and practice and experience is ongoing, probably throughout lifetimes, depending on the paradigm you believe in. But there's something really beautiful. I think that is something that keeps coming back to me, is that absolutely everything is a cycle.
Yeah.
It never ends, like that real circle kind of energy. So you'll always be learning.
Yeah, and I think there's aspects of again, in doing this work and approaching it, like you said, as a cycle, and just when you think you're done, you're not. You're actually, wow, what have I uncovered? What have I cultivated in this circle, in this go round? And similarly, I think I start to see a lot of patterns in things, which to me is very validating. It goes back to, yes, there's rigor in the academic study, and yes, there's rigor in the way we learn, because to me, those are sort of the building blocks to allow you to see patterns in things that otherwise people do not. And I'll give you an example of that, which will probably feed into the modalities question. Learning languages.
Oh yeah,
So
you speak how many languages?
I've had the opportunity to learn 6 languages, and I'm working on my 7th right now.
Wow.
So I think it's, language to me is a modality. And it's, I mean, if you simplify it, what better way to express spirituality than through language and spoken word, and being able to communicate in a way that connects you to another soul, connects you to another person. And so, my journey through languages has been interesting because I got to grow up around the world and live in a lot of different places. It's like more for survival, right? Which is like
Mhm.
you've got to learn the language in order to make your way. And then slowly I started to realize that this is not so much about my survival as it is about helping someone else feel belonging, feel a sense of connection and belonging. And so if, people listening to this will probably understand, if you've taken the time to learn a language and you go to a country where that language is spoken, and even if you fumble through those words to try and get your first sentence across, most of the time the person on the other side of that is elated, and you see
Yes.
in their eyes,
Yeah.
you see this joy, because what you're doing is, in one way, you're kind of connecting with them in a way they didn't expect, and it's a gift. It's a beautiful gift to say, I took time to learn your language so that I could
Yes.
connect with you.
I've
Uh,
definitely had that experience. Yeah, and it makes a huge difference. Especially, I learned French, and so I
mhm.
realized the reason that the French have this, bad rap, especially with Americans, is because Americans will go over and just expect it to be Disneyland and like just
Right,
be mad because they're not speaking English or
right,
whatever, and expect them to. And yeah, just you're right. Like just with my little fumbling and uh, probably preschool level grammar made a huge difference. Like we had, we're treated so much better and welcomed in because it's like an offering,
right. It's
Yeah, I
it's
took the
it's a
time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful gift, to say to someone, I took the time to try and navigate this world a little closer to the way you see it, and that is
Yes.
just a beautiful thing. So for me, languages have been a big modality, to get me closer to the experience that people are going through, and that's the empath side of me, right? I realize that if I have this highly sensitive person capability, I could sit here and I could try and deny it and fight it, and really struggle with it, and kind of be in pain, or I could lean into it and say, look, if you're kind of feeling what other people are feeling, and you might have a sense of what they're thinking, why not try and get closer to it? And language has allowed me to do that. And it's been a beautiful thing, and I think that's why I continue to do it, working on my seventh, and I imagine there might be an eighth. But that's one modality. I think the other thing, it's very similar, right? Which is, things like astrology.
Mhm.
I shared with you when we first met that I had just read, the McCarthy book around, you know, uh,
Juliana McCarthy.
Juliana McCarthy, yeah,
Mhm.
The Stars Within You.
Mhm.
And that was kind of a primer for me around astrology. And I think I had listened to a series of podcasts maybe, and I just got more and more interested in, like, okay, if I were to do, my natal chart and understand what this is, I again, the rigorous academic in me is like, well,
Yeah.
I have to know the grammar. I have to
Yeah.
be able to see how this works. And so I read that, and I just got more and more interested, and I realized that things like astrology and tarot and, numerology and other, they're additional languages. Um,
They're archetypal languages
yeah,
is which makes them a little bit more, oh, how would I say it? Beyond words.
exactly.
You know what I mean? And that's what, we discussed when we were, doing a reading. I found it really refreshing and helpful that you do understand how language works because that is how a lot of times how to string together all of the different aspects and elements of a natal chart you're learning a language.
Hmm.
There's a grammar to it and you kind of put it together in your own way. And I feel even there isn't like one set. What's really nice about it is that it is archetypal, and it gives one license to sort of develop the language and the way of speaking about it in their own
Hmm.
way. And so it's very poetic too. It can be very
Yeah.
poetic. It can be very more prose and fluid. Like, it's not, no one's going to come along and say, no, I mean, it to a certain extent, but like to a certain extent, you have creative license to sort of string it together in your own way and interpret it in your own way. So really astrologers we're essentially interpreters
Right.
of this archetypal language, and tarot as well. Tarot readers do the same thing, and it is very it's an empathic and intuitive gift as well, because you're connecting with a person
Hmm.
for the most part when you're doing readings, and finding a way, because no reading is the same. You're not going to read the same for every person.
Right.
It's again very um open to interpretation with how you connect with someone and are able to communicate and interpret for them, which makes it just a really beautiful, it's a beautiful language and really ongoing. Like you never know everything.
Right. And I think the I really appreciate you saying the poetic part of it, because if I think back to, you know, some of the stuff that I turn to regenerate and restore is a lot of writing and a lot of poetry and a lot of journaling. One of the languages I had the opportunity to learn was Russian growing up, and there are a few happier things to me than being able to really dive into like a Russian poem. Uh,
Wow. Yeah.
and there's a lot of intense emotions from Russian poets and Russian literature, and that's because they went through some intense experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can take those feelings and emotions and physical manifestations and put it into a word that resonates and is almost the personification of that feeling. It's a very powerful thing. So I appreciate you saying the poetic part of tarot and even astrology, because that's how it feels to me. It feels very poetic, and that's why I'm leaning into learning a little bit more about it, as additional, as an additional language. I think the other part, which is really fascinating to me around the natal chart, is the work that I've done. Modalities. I guess meditation and mindfulness might be a modality. I've started to realize that everybody has sort of an energy imprint and a frequency about them. Some people call it aura, but the work that I've done around meditation and mindfulness, I think, has just finely tuned my energy imprint or my frequency. And when I started to read into the natal chart, it just made sense to me. I thought, well, of course, like there's this earth, right? And we're all kind of made up of mostly water. And if you think about how energy works and transfers, like we're all just like these little beings of energy walking around this earth. And then a new person is born into the world, and that energy shifts because you have another, it's like adding another molecule to the
Mm-hmm.
mix. And I thought to myself, it makes perfect sense to me. Like you're born into this world, the planets are where the planets are, you're where you're at, and
Mm-hmm.
you basically added another element of energy to the mix that we have on this planet. And so I wanted to know more about that. And
Mm-hmm.
I also think there was aspects of my beginnings, being born in a place that was going through a lot of disruption at the time. I was actually born in Tehran in 1978, which was
Wow.
a pretty tumultuous time,
Mm-hmm.
pretty disruptive beginning. There was a revolution happening there. We had to flee. So selfishly, I've also had this sense of like, I've never been back to where I was born, right?
Mm.
I've never stepped foot in the place where I began life.
Mm-hmm.
First had that. That's part of why I'm fascinated by some of this.
Yeah. Just curious, is your lineage Iranian, or was your family just there?
We were just there, so
Oh.
we were Americans there. My father
Okay.
was working there as a businessman, and so in
Okay.
the mid to late 70s, there were quite a bit of Americans there. Some were with obviously oil companies, some were with accounting companies. My father was an accountant there, and so we were there as part of a job assignment for a couple years, and you know people can see in the history books that things didn't go so well in
Yeah.
1978. and we fled. And I think what's interesting as well is we went back to Rome. We had been in Rome before that. And I think another reason I have such a draw to Rome when I land there is because I think if you think about a baby or an infant, and you don't necessarily know what's going on, but you feel all the stuff going on around. If I enter the world and I'm in a very disruptive place where there's a revolution happening and people are worried about their safety and they're trying to take care of their children and they're getting on a plane and they're fleeing, and the first time that they have to actually take a breath and be like, we're okay, is in Rome. And so I think the part of the connection I have with Rome is because that's when all the people that were around me and were taking care of me and loving me, that's probably the first time their frequency and their energy got down to a level of like, we're okay.
Relief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so part of me probably had a little bit of an imprint on Rome and Rome on me. Just thinking about the order of events there. And so it's been fascinating. That's what I really kind of enjoy about, again, this new language of astrology, and as you mentioned, astrocartography would be probably fascinating to lean into as well.
How far away do you think we are from, because I'm sure this will be really helpful in your work. How far away do you think we are from incorporating, because we do MBTI in the corporate world and working world. How far away do you think we are from incorporating someone's natal chart into, their like the approach to helping them in the working environment?
It's a great question, and one that I'm probably going to think about for the next 5 days. It's pretty fascinating. I would take a guess that depending on the industry and depending on the work, we may be a generation or two away from that. And what I mean by that, and when I say generation, I don't mean like 70 to 90 years. I think what I mean by generation is
so in astrology, I'll just interject. In astrology, the generational marker is usually Pluto. So there's so you and I are of the Pluto and Libra generation. The Pluto and Scorpio generation is essential, and it's like oh gosh, I should know this off the top of my head. I want to say 12 to 14 years. Pluto and Scorpio is essentially the millennials, and then what we have now, people in their early 20s, I want to say late teens, early 20s, are the Pluto and Sagittarius generation. So I feel like maybe they are like super interested in astrology, and it's like no big deal to them. I feel like you're right. It's going to be when their generation is in the workforce.
Yeah, so I think you bring up the MBTI, and I talked about strength finders with you when we first met, and these are all different ways of getting at understanding kind of who we are and how we operate. And strength finders was a great one for me because I took the test 10 plus years ago, and my number one strength was empathy at the time. Wow. And I took it again recently, and it's still empathy. But what's interesting is the other strengths have changed, but empathy has not moved off the top of that rock, which told me, like, this is to your point, this is powerful, and lean into that. I think if we talk about the two generations from now, those that are coming into they're hungry, they're curious, they are not satisfied with the ways in which we've traditionally measured performance or motivation or inspiration. Like those mechanisms don't work for them anymore. So I think within two generations or two shifts of that, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody walked into a job and said, hey, I'm going to do MBTI, I'm going to do strength finders, I'm going to do the ENFJ or all that other stuff, and here's my astral, or here's my natal chart. The question doesn't become so much about the employee doing that. The question becomes about who they're walking it into. So I think the challenge, which would be pretty fascinating, and even this discussion is a great example of it, right? The education of the possibilities and the empowerment. I shared with my team not too long ago, I brought in the McCarthy book.
That's wonderful.
I had it on my desk so that people could see it. And, in some aspects you have to live out loud, right? Like, I in the years past, right, I had to live a very closeted life in many aspects of my life. I don't want to do that again. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm very proud of the fact that I'm curious and I'm learning and I'm pulling on every tool that I can to be a better person and to help others. So I had the book out on the desk. I wanted people to ask questions about it, and they did.
Uh,
And some of them were a little bit like, "Really, Bill?" And others were like, "That's amazing. Tell me more." And so it was a conversation starter. And I'm excited for when those people are more comfortable to get to the point where they say, you know, Bill, I'm curious to hear what you learned.
mm-hmm.
And again, I'm not out there, you know, proselytizing. I'm not out there telling people, hey, you have to, but I'm making myself available.
Finding the pathway is the real step.
Yeah.
It's because it's not a religion. It's not going out there and
No.
trying to convert anybody or tell them. But I think that remaining open, and you're right, like um, sharing that is an aspect of what you're about
Mhm.
is really important. Just putting that out in the open.
Yeah, I think the other part that I've been pretty fascinated by is there's a couple podcasts that I listen to. There's an Israeli, um, he's an ex-military officer, Israeli astrologer. I think he lives in LA. And he's done some pretty fascinating stuff where he's gone back and looked at the natal charts of significant figures in history.
Hmm.
And, you know, there's some debate around whether that we could have predicted what people would do, but I think there's more to that than people realize.
Oh yeah.
So it's those tendencies, it's when you go through the shifts, it's how people, you know, react. I think if somebody had said to me, hey, before you turn 40, you're actually gonna be pretty empowered um, by reflection and taking time for yourself and restoring. And I probably would have told them years ago, no way. Whereas now it all makes sense. So there's
Hmm.
aspects here that you know, nothing's ever a capital T truth, right?
Right.
But there's something that helps us understand what is more true to us. And so that's why I think it's fascinating. It'll be great to watch. So I'm trying to do
Hmm.
my part of that, like
Yeah.
bring the book in and have people ask questions.
Yeah. Well, it's a really efficient way to help relate to each other. And that's what I was thinking is like from an employer standpoint, it's just efficiency.
Yeah.
Like why would you try to, and that's what the old model is that I rebelled against most of my life was that um the old model was like get everyone to fit into the same
Yeah.
kind of box and way of working because I mean it's a holdover from the industrial revolution, right, or the
Correct.
industrial era. Like we were essentially trained to be factory workers or work in that kind of assembly line output, right in the midst of changing. And yeah, I love MBTI as well. I think that, and that's the thing, like going back to, it's not proselytizing or anything. Neither was psychology.
That's
Psychology
correct. Yeah.
and modern astrology is essentially it's called modern psychological astrology because
Yep.
depth psychology and Jungian astrology were kind of brought in to understand us ourselves and others on a psychological level.
Right.
So it's not that big of a leap, especially like we said for this current generation.
Right.
It's not like it's this far out there, oh, that's spiritual and woo woo. It
Hmm.
just is. Like the
Right.
evidence, if you look hard enough, or if you look, it's there. The evidence is there that it's a map or a way of it's like configuration. It's a configuration for timing
Right.
and how people work. So why wouldn't you bring that in as well? I don't
Yeah.
know. I
I
don't think
think
it'll be that long.
I don't think so either, and I think it'll be fascinating to, you know, if somebody needed to be, you know, understand the potential, I would probably say to them, wouldn't you want to save yourself on all those messy misfires and misstarts and hey, I thought you wanted this and you didn't want. To me, it's another tool at the table to really understand kind of what drives people or what, you know, what motivates them, or, you know, when we think about like you know, where your sun sign is in your moon sign, right? Like that's the whole aspect of like how you emote versus how you kind of show up in the world. And I think for me that was really powerful to know that I'm not necessarily retreating. I'm actually discovering that in order for me to recharge and process and go through some emotions, I actually have to do it in more of a what might appear isolated way, but it's not. It's much more about the power of solitude, and being restored in quiet as opposed to performing in
Mhm.
rambunctious, loud spaces. And so,
Mhm.
whereas before, I think people were very confused because they're like, Bill, you're an extrovert, and I'm like, right, I perform as an extrovert. But even the discussions in a workplace of understanding how do you embrace your introverts, and
Mhm.
what we see 8 to 5 is not necessarily who we are deep inside. And so that aspect to me, it's just given me another sort of another layer to understand myself.
Yeah, and especially discovering that you're, what's being called a highly sensitive person. That's a huge revelation as well. So yeah, how has that experience been? Like, when did you first hear that term? When did you, start noticing the this, I don't want to say side effects, but
Sure.
the,
Yeah.
the elements of that show up in your life? And also, how are you dealing with it? Because I feel like you've taken on a really good regimen of self-care
Hmm.
with
Yep.
multiple modalities that would, that would be nice if you would share that with others because there's a lot out there.
Yeah. So, I'm hoping that this small voice will be heard by many, and to say that when I kind of discovered this aspect of me, it was actually when I moved here to Seattle, so about 4.5 years ago. And again, I think when people move between places, know that you're kind of going through, like, you're kind of moving through different,
Energy
sets of energy,
fields.
yeah, energy fields. And I was moving from Washington D.C. to Seattle, so very different. But here in Seattle, I started to realize that I was just kind of picking up on very different energies. And there would be times, a quick story that I shared with you, was I was up in the Space Needle, with my brother Brian, who lives here in Seattle. And it was my first time in the Space Needle, and it was supposed to be this great afternoon. And I just couldn't, like, I couldn't catch my breath. I was like, felt weighed down, and I was like, what is going on? And it was afterwards that I realized, I was kind of picking up on everybody else's stuff, in that very condensed small space. And it was almost, like a flip of a switch. My brother was kind of like, "What happened? Like, you went from totally fine to, like, wow, you look dazed, you look tired." And I started to realize that I was much more kind of in tune with picking up on kind of what other people were feeling. And then I started to listen to that and kind of say, what might that be? Airports are always a little tough for me, right? So going through airports, if you think about it, people in airports, they're waiting to get to another destination, but on the other side of that destination is a hope, is a family member they love, is a job interview they're going for, right? There's a lot of hopes and fears and anxiety that's kind of just packaged into this little space.
Also, yeah, also it's like change on overdrive everywhere.
Correct. Yeah,
Everyone's
everybody's
it
going through
is
change.
you
Yeah,
go into like the survival mode. It's always like, okay, get the resources and the tools and okay, go to this
right.
place and make sure everyone's safe.
Right. And so that's where I started to realize, as a consultant who's traveling on the road quite a bit, I was like, oh, wow, like, these are little laboratories. These are like living classrooms for an empath to, like, walk through and figure out, okay, like, how do you spend your time in an airport so that when you're in that aluminum tube for 5 hours flying across the country, you're not bogged down, you're not exhausted, you're not trapped. And so I started reading about, sort of empaths and what typically happens, and some of the signs and feelings and symptoms, if you will, that we experience. And I had a conversation with a colleague who also is very, empathic, and, she said, "Oh yeah, like, there's a lot of resources that you can look at for this." And so I just started tuning in a little bit and realizing that, concerts. I love music. Music is very, very important to me. I feel like, the single strike of a chord on a guitar or a piano or somebody's voice can go straight to my rib cage and make me feel amazing. And I love live music, but I started to realize that in some of those venues, I couldn't actually be there to enjoy the music because everybody else, I was kind of carrying everybody else's stuff. So I started to say to myself, look, you've got to make some choices. You've got to have some sacred yeses and some sacred nos in terms of, if you're going to if you're going to be in airports all week and planes, maybe that's going to drain you to a certain point that you can't go to that concert on Friday night, or you can't go out to that bar. And it's okay. It's okay to say to yourself, I need to restore. I'm depleted. It doesn't make me weak. It doesn't make me less than, but I need to start to understand that. And then frankly, have conversations about that with my friends and family so they understand, because again, it goes back to belonging. If somebody were to say, hey, Bill, I want you to feel like you belong. And I'd say to them, absolutely. But then you say to them physically, when you're in that space or in that place, you feel anything but belonging. You actually feel overwhelmed and scattered. They would say, as a friend and someone that cares about you, what can I do? What can I do to help you? So for me, things like going on these, what I call silent Saturdays, where I spend 24 hours not speaking, is really, really helpful for me to sort of clear out the stuff that I think are my thoughts, but maybe not my thoughts. They're thoughts I picked up along the way.
Yeah.
Sensory deprivation saltwater floats,
Yep.
or sometimes people use the acronym REST, R-E-S-T. I forget what it stands for, but that's another way it's described. Those are tremendously helpful for me because it's about clearing that energy. It's almost like saging yourself.
Yeah, and just the salt water in general is super cleansing
Yes, I swim.
energetically.
Yeah, I swim maybe a couple times a week, 3 times a week if I can. So moving through water is really good for me. Being near water is really good for me. Just be able to look over the expanse and understand that even though it feels like you're carrying all this, you're still pretty insignificant against the expanse of that body of water or the universe or the horizon. And so I'm reminded of the delicacy of things. And then I come back to a place where I realize this is a gift. And it's truly an honor to be able to carry some of those things from other people and unburden them.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know it's happening. And sometimes I do know it's happening and other times I don't. But it all goes back to, can I help someone, get closer to their true potential? And sometimes that means taking off of their shoulders a little bit of burden. Whether walking by them or having a conversation with them or standing up in front of a group of 100 people and telling them, this is what change feels like, and you're going to be okay. So,
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love everything I've heard today.
thank you. Thank you.
Well, what's on the horizon for you as far as, work and life and expanding? Have you had any? We just had a new moon in Aquarius where we
Yep.
all made kind of these fresh new starts and intentions. Did you want to share anything you have coming up?
Yeah. So I actually have a spouse who is in the Peace Corps at the moment, and he's been serving overseas for over 2 years, and he will be coming home in the next few months. So I am really, really excited to have him home. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's going to be such a wonderful new the pleasure of visiting him 4 times since he's been over there, and spending that time together and making those memories. But I think, my intentions this year have really been about welcoming him back to our home here in Seattle, and we both grew as individuals and grew together in this process. And in the absence, while he was pursuing a dream, and me getting to support that dream has been pretty powerful. So I think that's one of the things I'm really excited about. I'm doing a tremendous amount of writing. So as I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, I do a lot of journaling and writing poetry. For the past couple of years, I've been writing my first novel. Obviously, it's hard to do when you have a full-time job, but that's coming back. That's coming back in a steady way. So I'm doing that writing. And then I think lastly, it's stuff like this. It's giving back. You and I both talked a little bit around how we've benefited from people sharing stories and podcasts. And, on those days when it's really gray and really dreary here in
Mm-hmm.
Seattle, nothing better than putting on a podcast and going for a long walk and putting the hoodie up.
Yep.
Um, those have been so restorative to me. And I believe in, like, you got to put it back out in the universe, and you've got to say thank you to all of those creators in a way by creating yourself. And whether it's through a novel or through a podcast or through an interview, share your story, bring that book in about astrology and have people ask questions about it. Go to a seminar and hang back afterwards and talk to the author. To me, it's about that creation and that give back. And I think it circles back to our first point around the power of belonging and connection and community. And if I can focus on those three things, I'm doing pretty well.
That's wonderful. I love everything you just said. Well, how can people connect with you, listen to your podcast? Do you want to share that?
Yeah, so my podcast is called Coffee and Change. And the concept basically came about that when you're doing what we're doing, talking about change, sometimes it's just better to sit down with someone over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and really just talk about change. It's a little more approachable. So that's how it came about. I think I've got about 13 or 14 episodes out there. It can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Store, SoundCloud as well. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. So if you just look up Bill Kirst, you'll be able to find me there. I do quite a bit of stuff on Twitter. It's a little bit of business and a little bit of personal. On Instagram, I do probably a little more kind of reflective stuff, great expansive horizons, pictures of mountains. That's where I can be found, and happy to connect with people. I'm hoping the sharing and the story, if heard by one person that says, yeah, this is helpful, or even if they have questions, they can reach out to you and you can connect them to me. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for the connection and the amazing expansive conversation.
You bet.
I hope you enjoyed this discussion around change in an ever-changing world. To dive more into this topic and Bill's work, give his podcast Coffee and Change a listen and visit him online on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. All the links can be found in the show notes to this episode at tristadedmond.com. And while you're there, consider signing up for the email list so you get every transmission of the Liberate Yourself podcast straight to your inbox. Thanks for listening, and as always, take care out there.